everybody. It's story time with Mary Jane, and we're back to reading some of our Helen Keller. Oh, yes, Helen, Annie whispered. That's it. And she bent down to hug the shaking little girl. But Helen pulled away. She didn't have time for that. Now she dropped to the ground and thumped on it hard. Name it, she was demanding. So laughing, sobbing, Annie did. Helen paused for a moment. She fluttered off the word on her fingers. She nodded. Then she whirled away again. In the next few minutes, she learned 6 new words, and she knew what they meant. Then suddenly Helen stopped. She thumped herself across the head. Annie burst out laughing. Yes, dear, she said. There's a word for you, too. And she bent down and spelled H-E-L-E-N into the little girl's hand. Helen had a name at last. Now Helen reached out and patted Annie's arm. At first, Annie thought she was just saying thank you, but Helen wanted something more than that. She patted Annie's arm again. Oh, said Annie, so you want to know that too. So Annie spelled out T-E-A-C-H-E-R into Helen's waiting hand. A few minutes later, 2 new people came out of the pump house. The wild little girl was gone, and so was the stranger. Now Helen Keller and teacher walked hand in hand. So much to learn. Helen wanted to know the names for everything she touched, and teacher gave them to her. Before the first day was over, Helen learned how to make 30-word shapes. Before the first month was over, she knew how to spell 100 words. From early morning until late at night, Helen spelled the words she knew. She spelled until her eyelids drooped and her fingers could hardly make the shapes. You really should slow her down, a worried friend said, or she will hurt her brain. Teacher just smiled. She knew that nothing could stop Helen now. By the middle of June, Helen knew more than 400 words, but there was one important word she did not know. Helen was 7 years old now. But for more than 5 of those years, she had been blind and deaf. During those 5 years, she had forgotten how to laugh. One day, teacher came bursting into Helen's room. She was laughing as hard as she could. She grabbed Helen's hand and held it to her upturned lips. L-A-U-F, she spelled into Helen's hand. Teacher picked Helen up and swung her around. They hopped, they skipped, they jumped around the room. Helen didn't know it, but teacher was leading her through the motions of happiness. And all the while she spelled laugh, L-A-U-G-H. Now teacher began to tickle Helen. Suddenly Helen smiled. Her smile grew wider. A chuckle escaped. Finally, with a great whoop, she began to laugh. Helen's mother and father had heard the noise coming from her room. They had come to the door to watch. Mrs. Keller leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. Oh, Arthur, she whispered, Helen's laughing. I never thought I'd hear that sound again. Soon Helen was ready to take her next big step forward. It was time, teacher said, for her to learn how to read. Teacher got out a big card. On the card were printed the 26 letters of the alphabet. Each letter stood up from the background so they could feel it. This was how the blind had to learn how to read, with their hands. And on the back of my book, I have it here. It's all the letters like A, B, C, D, and underneath it are little bitty bumps. And the blind learn how to read by feeling these bumps with their fingers. Teacher took one of Helen's hands and put it on the raised letter A. At the same time, she made the sign for the letter A into Helen's other hand. At first, Helen frowned and looked puzzled. She understood what was happening in one hand, but what was happening under her other? Teacher didn't try to explain. She just moved Helen's finger onto the next letter on the card B. She spelled out the same time into Helen's other hand. Helen still didn't seem to understand, but now she moved her own finger onto the next shape on the card C. Teacher spelled quickly. Helen kept on going. Teacher kept right up with her. Then suddenly, between one letter and another, Helen stopped. She began to smile, and suddenly she understood. Before the day was over, Helen learned all the letters of the alphabet. She was ready to move on to the words. That night, a tired but happy Annie Sullivan sat down and wrote a letter. Something tells me, she wrote, that I am going to succeed beyond my wildest dreams. Helen and teacher did not spend all their time hunched over alphabet sheets and word cards. A long-eared rabbit wriggled his nose. A smooth shell bug crawling across her palm, and the smell of wild grapes and the sweet, tart taste of them, too. There were so many other lessons to be learned outside, lessons from life. Helen planted a seed in the newly plowed earth. A few days later, she held a plant coming up in its place. She felt a plant. She learned the names of the trees that grew on her father's land and how to tell them apart by touch. One hot day, Helen and Teacher were coming home from a walk. They stopped under a tree to rest. Would you like to climb the tree? Teacher asked. Helen nodded yes. So Teacher helped her up. Then Teacher had another idea. It's cool here, she spelled. Why don't we eat lunch up in the tree? I'll go back to the house and make some sandwiches. You wait for me here. Helen nodded happily. She thought it was fun to wait up in the tree, but suddenly a change came over the day. The air grew cooler. All the heat seemed to fade away. Helen frowned. The sun must be hiding behind a cloud, she thought. And what was that strange smell coming up from the ground? Helen took a deep sniff. Then she knew it was a smell that always came right before a really big storm. The wind began to blow. Helen felt thundering all around. This was thunder. But to Helen, it seemed as if the giant were dropping something heavy nearby, and it was coming closer all the time. Teacher, teacher, teacher. Helen's fingers fluttered frantically, but the wind only blew harder, and nobody came. A branch broke over Helen's head. Twigs splattered down around her. Jump, Helen thought, but what if she did? Would she go flying off into space? Would she crash to the ground? Helen decided to hang on, but her fingers were slipping. She could not hold on much longer. Then Helen felt the most wonderful thing in the world. Teacher's arms lifting her down from the tree. That's all for today.